I read this one. Hello, everyone. So, as many of you know, before I went on Shlichut, I had the privilege of studying in a place called Eretz Chemda. There's a kollel in Katamon, not far from here. So I studied where I work a little bit today as well. One of the special projects that Eretz Chemda has, which has been running for a number of years, the Responsa project, called B'Mareh Bazak in Hebrew, or Ask the Rabbi in English, where originally when it began, it was under the guidance of Rabbi Israeli. It was the questions would come in and they would be sent back by fax. And that was where the name B'Mareh Bazak came from. Nowadays, the questions are sent in and sent back by email. So it's even quicker. And it was a very, very special opportunity to be involved in answering some of those questions. And to this day, you know, there are questions that are received from around the world. And up to date, there are 9 volumes published so far in Hebrew. The 10th is currently in preparation. At least 6 volumes published in English, covering all 4 sections of Shulchan Aruch, covering some of the usual topics of Shabbat, Kashrut, Tefillah, etc., covering some of the more cutting-edge topics as well. So what I thought is that during this slot, look at some of the Shelot and Shuvot, some of the responses that have come in over the years, some of the questions in B'Mareh Bazak, Ask the Rabbi, whatever it's called. Disclaimer, this has got nothing to do with Parashat Shavua, so I could pretend to find a connection, but there is none. But hopefully you'll find it enjoyable as well. So I'll start off with a relatively mundane question today, one of the questions that appears in one of the earlier volumes. An interesting shaila nonetheless, to do with Hilchot Shabbat. So the question was asked, somebody on Motzei Shabbat wants to travel by taxi, travel by bus, whatever it is, but the taxi driver has not made Havdalah. Now, there is a prohibition to do Melacha before you've made Havdalah, Motzei Shabbat. Talk about exactly what that means, having made Havdalah, but Shulchan Aruch is explicit. We know there is a prohibition as well of Lifnei. Now, in this case, talking the person, the individual asking the Shaila has made Havdalah themselves. So they're not doing any Melacha. But there is a prohibition of Lifnei Iver, of causing somebody else to do something which they can't do. So this taxi driver, who you know has not made Havdalah, is not going to make Havdalah anytime soon. The fact that he was driving around, whatever, before you came along, before you got into the taxi, what he was doing then is his business. It's got nothing to do with me. But the fact is, I've called him now, and he's coming and he's driving me around. Again, this is Motzei Shabbat. We're not talking about on Shabbat itself. Whatever it is, we called it. He calls him on Motzei Shabbat. He gets into the taxi. What? Yeah. You can't have a camp on Sunday or Monday. You're saying something. The same thing is going to extend. Okay, but there's a question here. We'll deal with it. But the question is, he at least initially can't do melacha because he hasn't made Havdalah. Can you get into that taxi and can you use it, or are you transgressing the prohibition of Lifnei Iver? That's the question. I'll give you a spoiler. Which is that just about all the poskim say at the end of the day here it's going to be mutzah. But the question is why, and the question is how we get there. In order to get to that answer, there are one of 2 ways that we could do this. We have to look at what is the prohibition of doing melacha before Havdalah? Again, doing melacha on Motzei Shabbat, but before Havdalah. Why is that a prohibition? What's the prohibition of Lifnei Iver? How do the 2 come together? And so we go like that. So the Gemara in Shabbat, Gemara in Masechet Shabbat makes it clear towards the end of the Masechet that one would need to make Havdalah before one can do before one can do melacha on Motzei Shabbat. What does Havdalah mean? So just by way of introduction, we have 3 different forms of Havdalah, which are familiar to us. There is Havdalah Betfilah, right? When we say Shmona Esrei and Maariv, we say Atachon and Tanu. There, that is Havdalah. Again, in the same way, by the way, that when we have Kiddush on Friday night, we're bringing the source, Zachor et Yom HaShabbat lekotcho. We have to remember Shabbat when it comes in, when it goes out. The way we do that, at least on a Doraita level, is by words, by speaking. That's enough. Chachamim came along and said, no, you need to do it over the course as well. You need to have a cup of wine. So that's the case for Kiddush on Friday night. That's the case for Havdalah. So we have Havdalah, which is in Tefillah. We have Havdalah, which is ala kos. And then, now, when you've done one, you're required to do both. But then there is another type of Havdalah, which the Gemara mentions, where a person has not yet done Havdalah but Tfilah or Alakos, which is familiar to all of us. We say, Baruch HaMavdil ben Kodesh L'cho, right? And then you can, from that time on, you can do Melacha. If you're waiting for somebody to come and perform Havdalah and they're not going to be there yet, you don't have the cup, whatever it is, you say Baruch HaMavdil ben Kodesh L'cho, and then you can do Havdalah, you can do Melacha. So the Gemara says that Rav Ashi, when he was by Rav Kahana, that it was on Motzei Shabbat, and Rav Kahana, before he chopped wood, said Baruch HaMavdil ben Kodesh L'cho. Okay. So from there we see, from this Gemara, that one needs to say some form of Havdalah before performing Melachas. We learn two things. One is that you need to do Havdalah before you can do Melacha. You also learn that it doesn't need to be the full Havdalah that can come later, but there needs to be some sort of distinction before you can go and start doing Melacha, before you can. An example the Gemara gives is chopping wood. We'll see if there's significance to that particular example as well. Now, all of this still doesn't help us with our question, because this taxi driver, he's not doing Havdalah Lakos, he's not doing Havdalah Batfilah, he's not saying Baruch HaMavdil ben Kodesh L'cho, he's not doing any. So interesting. So the Shulchan Aruch in Siman Reish Tzadik Tet writes there's an entire Siman talking about you can't eat before Havdalah, you can't do Melacha before Havdalah. Shulchan Aruch writes that you can't do any Melacha, right? Asur lasot shum Melacha, this language uses, before one is done Havdalah. He says if you've done Havdalah and Tfilah, that's enough, even before the course. And if you want to do Melacha before that, you say Baruch HaMavdil ben Kodesh L'cho. Then the Ramah brings a very interesting opinion. Ramah quotes one of the Rishonim, Rabbeinu Yerucham, and Rabbeinu Yerucham says all this that we're talking about, that there's an Isur Melacha, is if it's a Melacha Gemura, a complete Melacha. We need to understand exactly what that means. And he says, for example, if it's like Kotev or Oreg, like writing or weaving, those are the examples he gives. But if it would be something else, for example, lighting a candle, or Hotza'ah Merashut L'Rashut, he says that is something which would not be, that you would be allowed to do before you've made Havdalah. Okay, this is the opinion of Rabbeinu Yerucham. The Ramah says that based on this opinion, there was a minhag where they would, immediately after Baruch Hu, they would light candles. Man doesn't like this minhag. He says, Ha'ikar kisfara rishona. He says, we should be machmir. But there is such an opinion that exists in the Rishonim that one could do certain types of melachot even before making Havdalah. So the question is, what are these types of melachot? What does he mean when he says melacha gemura? It's clear he doesn't mean that a melacha gemura that would be forbidden on Shabbat, because lighting a candle is certainly a melacha gemura in the sense that it would be forbidden. So a number of the Achronim explain over here that he means melacha that sheyesh bo torach, a melacha that's got, in the sense that it takes exertion, requires effort, perhaps requires time. It's not something, very, very simple thing to just go and light a candle, whereas sitting down and weaving or writing in those days, we're talking about, you think of a Sofer Stam, that sort of writing. Okay, but that's what he says. Nonetheless, the Ramah says that we shouldn't rely on this opinion. And a lot of the Achronim question, the Beit Yosef already brought this, Rabbeinu Yerucham. He says, I don't understand it. What difference does it make? One melacha to another? They're all calling this melacha gemara, calling that melacha gemara, but they're all forbidden. So therefore, the Magen Avraham says, no, Rabbeinu Yerucham was actually talking about something else entirely. He says, when Rabbeinu Yerucham said you could do certain melachot before Havdalah, he was talking about the following: that there are Rishonim who say they are stringent to the other side, who say that once you've done Havdalah only in Tefillah, but you haven't done the full Havdalah yet, you still can't do Melacha. You have to wait until you've done Havdalah on the course and you've done everything. Says Rabbeinu Yerucham, that's only if we're talking about a Melacha Gemura that's going to take exertion, it's going to take effort. But to do something simple like lighting the candle, he says that you could do after you've done Havdalah b'Tefillah, before you've done the whole Havdalah. Okay, and he says the Taz, this is how we understand why the example that the Gemara gave us was. Sorry, we'll come back to the Taz in a moment. So that's one opinion. That's one opinion that rejects the Rabbeinu Yerucham. Says it's actually talking about something else, talking about a case where you had done some form of Havdalah. But on this, the Taz, who is known for in many times, it has very, very original very creative in his perushim. Many times he gives a psak, which is not the same as what the other Nosei Kelim have to say. The Taz, in fact, says that one could rely on this Rabbeinu Yerucham, and he says he understands him kipshuto, meaning that you could do these melachot before having done any form of havdalah. And he says that's why the Gemara gave the example of chopping wood. Says the Gemara with Rav Ashi and Rav Kahana said before you wanted to chop the wood, you had to say Baruch HaMavdil, but because that's something unusual, that's something which requires more effort, that's something which requires more time. If you were just lighting the candle like you do every week, for that you wouldn't necessarily be required. Okay, so that's in terms of that. So that's the Rabbeinu Yerucham, that's the Ramah, as we've said. Now we don't rely on this opinion. We're not going to rely on it ourselves in order to do melacha. If we're talking about relying it on combining this opinion with the idea of lifnei iver, so it's something which is more indirect, and you're relying on the fact that it may not be lifnei iver because there is an opinion that holds that he could do it. So then we have something to rely on. However, now the question would be this: we're talking about driving. Well, how do we define driving as a melacha? Is this the type of melacha? Oh wait, forgot to mention. The Taz says, and Mishnah Berurah says when Rabbeinu Yerucham talks about melacha, he says shesh bo torach, that it's not exertion. The words that the Taz uses he says melechet uman. We find in many places. We find most notably by Chol HaMoed, but there is a difference between different types of melacha. What's called a maaseh hedyot, which is something that anybody can do, and a maaseh uman, which is something which requires great skill, which requires certain level of professionalism, of training. So, do we define driving as a simple melacha, in which case then bringing all these opinions together, we could say it would be permitted? Or do we say that it is a maaseh uman, is something which requires great skill? So Tzitz Eliezer says that driving in this context we would consider as a maaseh uman. Right? Why is that? It could be because what's that?
He makes his living that way.
He makes his living that way. Okay, but it could be that it requires, in order to, once a person, many people drive, and once a person knows how to drive, it comes quite naturally, instinct, etc. But it's something which requires you have to learn. It's not so simple. For the taxi driver, it could be that because it's the professional capacity, there's an added level of concentration. Maybe that's what you could say. What's that?
More skilled to drive a monkey's way to drive.
That's true. So
it's only halacha which requires a test, examination, before one is allowed to do it. He automatically regards as master.
Not necessarily. Perhaps that's part of it. But again, if it's something which the masses do, and most. In any event, once he says that says that it's maaseh uman, so now this Rabbeinu Yerucham doesn't help us anymore, because you still need to do havdalah before you can do that. So where do we go? So the Tzitz Eliezer suggests the following. He says you look at what is the nature of this prohibition of not doing melacha before you've done havdalah. There are two ways you could look at it. He says it could be that the prohibition of melacha on Shabbat simply extends until the time that you've done havdalah. In the same way that on Friday nights we can bring in Shabbat early, and from the time that we've brought in Shabbat, then there is an Isur Melacha. Now it's Shabbat when we have the power to bring it in early. In the same way, you could say that when Shabbat goes out, well, Shabbat hasn't gone out yet until you've done Havdalah. That Isur Melacha remains, and that is there. That's one possibility. Or another possibility, which is the Taz writes that actually Midoraita, the minute Shabbat is out, there would be no Isur to do Melacha. It's only Chachamim came along and were mitaken that you have to do Havdalah first. Why? Maybe because, like we find in many places in Halacha, where we have something which is time-bound, which we're required to do at a certain time, Chachamim said, don't do anything else before you do this action, otherwise you might not do it in time, you might forget it, you might not give it the requisite amount of respect. Right? We find this most famous examples by Bdikat Chametz. Right? Everybody knows there are Simanim in Shulchan Aruch. What can you do? What can't you do before the time of Bdikat Chametz? But really, it's the same thing when the time for Tefillah arrives, when the time for Kriyat Shema arrives, right? So it could be the same idea here, that in order to give the proper credence to Havdalah, you can't do any melacha before. If we go by that understanding, then the Rabbeinu Yerucham makes a lot more sense, because he would say that if it's a simple melacha that's not going to require any effort, it's not going to require any time, so you'll do it before, and you'll still do Havdalah, not concerned. But on the other hand, saying which is going to take more time, then you can't do it before. So says the Tzitz Eliezer, if we go by that second understanding, and then we would say, first of all, now we're saying there's not an intrinsic problem of doing melacha before Havdalah, but it's a gzerah of Chachamim, in order that you'll still do Havdalah in time. Now we're saying it's for somebody else. It's lifnei iver. It's far enough removed that there's already what to start making leniencies. But he says furthermore, it's very interesting chiddush. He says all of this would only apply for somebody who's going to make Havdalah, right? You're going to make Havdalah anyway. So Chachamim said, don't do these other things, so you don't delay it. For this taxi driver who's never going to make Havdalah, there's no concern he's going to make Havdalah. He's never going to make it in the first place. So he says for him, the problem of delaying actually wouldn't apply. It's ironic because he's not doing it. Therefore, the prohibition is removed in a sense. But that's one reason that he gives. It's one explanation. Says the Tzitz Eliezer. Therefore, there would be no issur here. One other point which he mentions, and a number of poskim mention this as well. It's brought in Shmat Shabbat Kel Chata, I believe in the name of Shlomo Zalman. He says that if we said that Havdalah, it doesn't have to be the full Havdalah on the course. It can be Baruch HaMavdil Ben Kodesh L'Chol is enough. So any statement, any sort of declaration of saying that I'm no longer interested that it should be Shabbat, but that it is now the week, that would apply. And therefore he says, if you say Shavua Tov to the driver, and the driver says Shavua Tov to you first, and that would take the place of Havdalah, and that, according to in his opinion, would you can try that. But there we go.